Hey, folks, welcome back to the Mac and Mike show. I would be the Mac and he would be the Mike. And no, I'm not talking about the microphone. I'm talking about your good old buddy, Air Force vet, Mike Kelly. So I came across a very interesting video, and it was one of these people, who have these radio programs or podcasts, and they were interviewing people, and they happened to be interviewing a gentleman from South Africa. Now, South Africa is not much in the news these days, but this video was rather shocking in many different ways. I think I guess there was some international conference going on, and this particular gentleman, I don't remember his name, but he was a fifth generation born and raised in South Africa, went to the University of South Africa, made himself a pretty good sum of money, although he started for money. His grandfather had, I think, started a big mining conglomerate in South Africa. So about 30 years ago, he left the country, came to the United States, worked for a very successful investor, described himself as a right-hand man. And then he went to Europe and he opened some other new businesses. At the end of that, after 30 years of being away from his home country, South Africa, he returned, only to find, to his shock and horror, a very different country than he left. And that's what Mike and I are going to talk a little bit about today, because I think it's interesting, number one. Number two, I don't think the Americans hear about it very much. If we think about Africa at all, we think about Africa, the continent, not the many and various countries that exist on the continent of Africa. And furthermore, if we think about Africa at all, we think about there being a majority of African American, well, we can't call them African Americans, they're African, right? But dark-skinned people. And from that perspective, I'm going to welcome Mike into the conversation. Mike, did you watch the video I sent you?
Yeah.
What were your impressions? Were there any range of emotions from either end of the spectrum that you felt or learned from watching that very short video?
Not so much from the video. I have personal experience with South Africans. My pharmacist, who I was kind of friendly with, was South African up here in Pennsylvania. And you might remember I moved to North Carolina for a couple of years. Well, I was back and forth. And it's so funny, my pharmacist down there had come over to America with my pharmacist from Middletown, Pennsylvania. They knew each other.
That's crazy.
And I developed a rapport and a relationship with these girls because of that. They, just liked talking to me for whatever reason. I took an interest in them. And they were telling me about why they left and how bad it was for their parents, and that they were hoping to get their parents over to the United States. And so this was a long time ago. Now, the gentleman in the video, he just returned. So he had been gone for, what, I think 30 years. But these girls had told me the same thing, and that was happening a dozen years ago. Now, the thing that the gentleman in the video mentioned was the new law that was passed, which is about confiscating land. And, you can go back and forth on it. But what it boils down to is the government can take your land and not give you compensation under certain circumstances. And because of the recent history, it's kind of like America. The blacks here in America are expecting reparations. Well, because apartheid did exist for so long, that now many of the blacks in South Africa are seeking vengeance. So, there's stories about how they kill the farmers, they take their land, they don't give them compensation. And Donald Trump recently spoke about it a couple times and said that he was fast tracking citizenship in the United States for those that were under persecution in South Africa. So that was the thing that the gentleman in the video alluded to. Thank God Donald Trump is talking about this, because he knows the horrors. I mean, it's reverse, we call it reverse discrimination, which is just discrimination. It's just the different races. And just for demographics' sake, the population of whites in South Africa is about 8% white, 80% black. They call them colored. That's their term in their government. Colored is a mixed thing: Indian, Pakistani, black, Hispanic. Every race. They just call them colored. That's about 9%, and direct from India or Asia around 3%. So the way the laws are written, and there's a disputed amount between 116 and 142 laws that actually talk about the race of the person. And the people that are basically excluded in the law are the 8% whites. So, in that sense, imagine in America, if you said, okay, all these laws apply to white people only, the good things, and the bad things are going to apply to the blacks and Hispanics and people like that. That's exactly what they're doing. It's a revenge type situation. That's all I have to say right now.
It's interesting that you have a personal experience with that, Mike. I didn't know that. I think that's a very interesting aspect of this question, because all I know about South Africa is that people like Elon Musk, there's been some other successful members of the South African society that have emigrated to the United States and been successful. So your pharmacist being a South African and wanting to bring her family to America is a very interesting aspect. What I do know is as you mentioned, there was apartheid. Everybody remembers Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela, there was a movie about the soccer team, right? And Mandela was kind of like the hero of South Africa, eliminating the discrimination that occurred to the blacks and the coloreds by the whites. And there's no doubt, apartheid was a thing that didn't give the majority of the people who lived there equal rights. Now, that it's such a difficult topic to talk about, because as soon as you hear that, ingrained in Americans from years and years and years, probably from our civil rights days, that there shouldn't be discrimination, there shouldn't be inequality, there should be fairness for all races, colors, and creed. It's even called out in our Constitution, right? And our Declaration of Independence. So it's hard for us. But then there's the reality. You mentioned the new law, confiscation without compensation. That doesn't even sound like a good thing, and the example that the guy in the video uses is they can come take my watch. They'll literally take my watch off my wrist and they don't have to pay me for it. I don't think any American would want to exist in that kind of world. We wouldn't want to be in a society that allowed people, just because of their skin color, to take that kind of advantage of somebody with a different skin color. At least I hope most Americans would. And I'm sure you'll find some people that will say, hey, damn straight, we've been dealing with this discrimination all this time. We deserve our turn. But I think they are significantly in the minority, and that's not a pun. But he did mention over 140 laws that call out somebody's race in the law. That too doesn't sound like something that America would want to deal with. But what do you do in a nation that 20 years ago had the finest airline on the continent of Africa, and today it's the worst? What do you do with a country that 30 years ago was an exporter of many products, including food? And today, if they didn't have food imports, people would starve to death. What do you do with a country when the electricity generation and delivery system, that is the electrical grid in the country, because of their lack because of the demand that they have. I don't know the whole story. It may be an increase in population. There may be many reasons why there's more demand for electricity than there is electricity available. But again, according to this guy in the video, fifth generation South African, this man had white skin, and it's entirely possible, I guess, that he is just a racist that feels like he's been shut out of his own country and he's bitter. But he spoke with such authority and he spoke with such direct knowledge that it seems to me improbable that what he was saying was not accurate. And what he did say was that they have what they call load sharing for electricity, which is another way of saying between 6 and 8 hours a day, you don't get electricity so that other people in the nation can have it. And, I know we have brownouts and blackouts and stuff in America, but usually that's an equipment failure. There's usually enough electricity going around, although in the state of California, they are testing the limits.
Right.
So, what would you do in that environment where simply because of the color of your skin, you're allowed to effectively be raped and murdered with no consequences? Does that sound like a good thing for anybody? And again, I'm a white guy and people are going to say, well, you're a racist just because you have white skin. You can say those kind of things. You've never been on the receiving end of all this terrible treatment. Yeah, that's true. I get it. I've not been discriminated against in this country. In certain ways, I have been. We have certain laws. I remember working for a very large company. I won't mention the name, but I applied for a specific job in that company. And I kept, I follow up with the head of the department. The job wasn't filled. The job wasn't. I'd keep calling. Hey, I'm still interested. I'm interested. Could you give me a call? I'd really like to apply. I've applied for the job. I've not even gotten called for an interview yet. I have all the qualifications. Finally, the guy calls me on the phone and said, "Look, McCormick, quit nagging me. You're blowing it up here. I can't hire you. You're a dude, and I need to hire a woman for that job." Those were in the early days, of the EEOC, where we had to we had to break down the barriers, and we had to put women into men's jobs and men into women's jobs, and I'm not opposed to those quotas. I'm just saying that in some ways I was discriminated against. It wasn't a big deal, but in a small way I have felt it personally. So, Mike, I don't know how, I remember a story one time that the Reverend Jesse Jackson told. And this is going to sound racist, but please don't hate on me because I'm not the author or the originator of this story. It is Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson told this story on television where he's in New York City and he's walking down the street and it's late at night, maybe early in the morning. It's very, very late and it's very dark. And he hears footsteps behind him. So almost involuntarily, he diagonally crosses the street to the sidewalk on the other side of the street. And as he does that, he turns and looks, and the person who was walking behind him was a white guy. And as he's telling the story, he said, "I can't tell you how relieved I was that it was a white guy and I wasn't likely to be mugged." Now, that was his story, okay? And I don't know if that's discrimination or if that's a recognition of reality. But that kind of thing, as I've been led to believe, is going on in South Africa on a daily basis. And if there is no liberty, if there is no freedom, if there is no private property rights, in this nation, I don't know if you recall history, but when the Declaration of Independence was written, it originally said that we were entitled by our Creator to life, liberty, and property. And they changed that to the pursuit of happiness because they didn't want to codify in our Declaration of Independence the idea that at the time slaves were property. And they didn't want to codify the idea that that property was protected by our founding documents. So that's why it was changed to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I'm sure you knew that, Mike. I'm not sure if everybody knows that because we don't do a good job of teaching our children today history. But the point I'm trying to make is that was one of the life, liberty, and property were the important factors that led to the formation and the founding of this nation. Imagine if we didn't have security of private property. And I know there's ways the government through eminent domain can take property that's necessary for the greater good. I get that. I'm not disputing that. What I am saying, though, is our founders truly believed in individual property rights. And as I understand it, if you're white and live in black, the ANC stands for African National Committee, African National, yeah, I think, sorry, African National Committee, right? At any rate,
Conference, I can't remember.
okay. As I understand it, a white man walking down the street can be accosted and property can be taken from him without compensation. And I don't know any American of any skin color who would stand for that kind of treatment. I just don't.
Well, if you read the laws and get into it deeper, the way it's written, they actually use the word equity. So that's, I guess, the scary part. You can appeal all these things in courts, but then the courts are rigged against you if you're white, I imagine. At least that is the fear. Interestingly enough, you bring up property. In the United States in the early days, I guess some states required men only who could vote, number one, to own land and pay taxes in order to be allowed to vote. In other words, you had a vested interest in the country. It wasn't like you were just working for somebody. It was actually, it's sort of like today. We think about public schools and then you think about public toilets. What do they have in common? You don't probably want to go into any of them, or, because nobody has ownership. It's, quote, public. Now,
Right.
there are exceptions to this. There's great public schools and there's actually clean public toilets. But by and large, ownership gives you a vested interest, like home ownership versus renting. You being into real estate, you know this, that if a person owns a home, they're a lot more likely to take care of it than if they're just renting it.
That's right.
So that's one thing. And this may be, it's not an overblown thing, but the laws are written in such a way that they actually match up with the current Constitution. And in some ways that you read it, it doesn't sound that bad. I looked it up. I didn't get into all of the 141 laws, just a general overview. And it's just the word equity again. It's kind of like here in the US. And by the way, whites still own the majority of property and wealth in South Africa, even after, Nelson Mandela came to power and the blacks basically took over. I don't know why. I think it's because a certain number of them came to a recognition that these rich white landowners actually were the ones who were keeping everything running. It's like Saudi Arabia couldn't get the oil out of their own land if they didn't have Western engineers come in to do it. So it's a mix probably too. It probably is very different if you're in Johannesburg versus a more rural area as well. So, these disparities aren't across the board, across the country. They're probably very localized and regionalized. But then you look at the way the law, like, look at what we're doing. We think law, the way it's written, can be good or bad. But look what they did to President Trump. Lawfare. Almost his whole last presidency, through 4 years he wasn't president, and it continues today. It really just shows you how the law can be used in a very corrupt way, yet still the law is written to meet the Constitution.
Right.
People have a way of twisting everything. So it happens here, it happens there. There, it's just based on race. Here, it's based on your political views.
What's funny, you mentioned the United States and race and laws, and just prior to the Civil War, there was a law that was passed. The southern states, that is the slave states. The House of Representatives, obviously, as you know, and most people know, the House of Representatives is based on population. So the greater your population, the more members of the House of Representatives you and your state gets. And prior to the Civil War, what the slave states, the southern states, were arguing is, well, these slaves that we have on our plantations, they should be counted for purposes of the number of representatives we get in the House of Representatives. And the free states, or the non-slave states, most of them being the northern states, they argued against that. And there was a compromise that was arrived at, and the compromise said that a slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Many people who don't understand that whole dynamic said, look at how racist the United States of America was. They only wanted to count people with black skins as 3/5 of a person. But if you understand, and some great abolitionists of the day, including the very, very famous men with black skin, said, you don't get this. This is an anti-slavery law. If they got credit for a full person from every slave, the southern states would have many more representatives. They would dominate the House of Representatives, and there would always be more slave states added to the union because they would vote that way. And so the compromise of 3/5 of a person for purposes of counting for the representation in the House of Representatives was to limit the power of the slave states in creating laws. It actually benefited the anti-slavery or the free states. And that's one of those things where you say, you read the law and it's confusing. If you don't have the background, if you don't have an understanding of why that law was instituted, you may be confused.
Yeah, context, everything. It's context in politics. You just think about it. We often show the videos, and then they chop the video so that you don't hear the rest of the story. Was it Paul Harvey? And now for the rest of the story.
Yeah.
And the background's always it's important whether we're studying psychology, religion, philosophy.
Yep.
And how many times have you heard Nietzsche taken out of context? God is dead. Well, he even though he was an atheist, he didn't mean it in a negative. Well, he meant it in a negative way. It was the Enlightenment had come, and he wasn't quite sure that God being dead because of the Enlightenment was a good thing. And he recognized that as an atheist. So, that's misunderstood. There's many things that we take out of context. That one of them, the 3/5 of a person. Yeah, I knew that one too. And I can't remember how long ago I read about that, but I know it's been in the last 10 years. So for the majority of my life, I didn't understand that myself. So that's what we're here to do, right? Is hopefully educate a few people.
Yes, but I think that, I remember when Desert Storm started. If you recall, Saddam Hussein in Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the famous quote from then President George H.W. Bush was, "We're drawing a line in the sand." And it kind of made sense because all of that territory over there is sandy. It's all so. And that quote has now been used many other times where there was no sand. I'm drawing a line in the sand. But the point I'm trying to make with the line in the sand is that what George H.W. Bush was advocating was that if free nations stand by and do nothing, while any other free nation liberty and property is taken away from them, then that is a front to all those who believe in liberty and democracy and representative republics and those kinds of, that is the power of the government comes from the people. So, the whole line in the sand was, you can't take, Mr. Hussein, you cannot just, because you're more powerful, take the country of Kuwait and call it your own. And does someone need to ask that question about South Africa? I know no one's invaded it, Mike. There's no military power that said, hey, we're coming across your border and we're taking over your institutions. But what happened was with this unleashing of the ANC and the new laws governing voting, and I'm not advocating for apartheid. Don't anybody write us a nasty note and say you're advocating for apartheid. I'm not. That's stupid. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that I understand why some people want revenge or retribution or whatever, or they, in your words, they wanted what's the current word we're using to reparations? They wanted reparations. I'm not disputing that there should be a conversation about that in a nation that is 80% African with dark skin, but there has to be fair treatment of all people, right? Even if they're, and again, this gets back to you and I being Christians, right? I mean, what would Jesus do? What would God say? He wouldn't say, just because you've been mistreated for 100 years, that doesn't mean for the next 100 years you get to mistreat the new minority. So what happens, what obligation, if any, maybe none at all, does any other nation of the world have as we watch South Africa, being basically being driven into the ground? We watch Ukraine and all the money we sent to Ukraine, and Ukraine is run by oligarchs, and maybe Russia is run by oligarchs, and the people don't get advantage of the wealth of the nation. And maybe the capitalism society or capitalism view or system of economics is perfect either. But if the money that's in South Africa is being taken by a relatively few number of people, even those with black skin, should that be tolerated? Is that acceptable? Do other free nations have any obligation? And I could argue either side of that. I would argue against America getting involved in foreign nations' domestic issues. Should anyone, especially America, because we have a big boot and we oftentimes tend to put it down in places it shouldn't be. We've been in a number of wars that way. A couple of wars that you participated in, Mike, that probably weren't America's finest moments. Does anyone have an obligation other than South Africa to try to fix the new form of discrimination that's going on?
No, I don't think we do. But I do think we have, a right as a nation. Like, one thing Trump did is he cut off all aid to South Africa. So when countries diverge too much from standard international norms that we see in the West as healthy and good for the people, I think it's very fine for us to withdraw any kind of aid. It's like you wouldn't, as Christians, we wouldn't support pro-abortion buildings, personnel, and policies. It's like you don't want to give your money and your resources and your treasure to organizations or countries that don't align at least with some modicum of decency. That's what I think.
It's interesting. We have reports, we have proof that there are many minorities in the nation of China that are being discriminated against, that are being rounded up and put in re-education camps. Yet there are no trade barriers enacted for the nation of China based on human rights failures. And as we recognize human rights failures in South Africa, and with President Trump recently mentioning that. Um, it's kind of like the news when a young woman gets kidnapped, right? If it's a young, blonde, blue-eyed, college cheerleader, it's the leading news story in all the major news networks. But if it's a minority in the slum of Chicago, the South Side slum of Chicago, it's not the leading news story. Is it the same kind of thing with South Africa or with the Uyghurs or any other minority group in China that's being discriminated against? Do we intentionally not want to notice it? And I don't know the answer to that too. And the question, I agree with you, by the way. I don't want American troops anywhere but defending North America. And that may include Canada and Mexico and maybe even Greenland because of a lot of the different security issues. But should America, so let's set the idea of military intervention in South Africa or anywhere else off the table. Should we do economic or any other kinds of sanctions because we disagree with their internal politics and the way they're treating their minorities? Should that be something we do or participate in or lead the charge for other countries to do the same?
Well, I think sanctions are different than offering money to those other countries. Like one is what we support, and the other is trying to strong arm them into being what we want them to be. So I agree that we shouldn't necessarily go around sanctioning countries just willy-nilly, but not giving countries money, that's a totally different thing.
I agree.
It's sort of like here in America, somebody does something that somebody doesn't like, whether it's Budweiser or Tesla on the other side, and people say, well, I'm not going to buy the product, or they're going to like burn the Teslas or whatever. Not buying a product is one thing. That's fine. You don't want to buy Budweiser, you don't want to buy a Tesla, no big deal. You want to now burn down the Budweiser facility or burn up, and shoot at and destroy Teslas and Tesla vehicles and sales places, that's completely different. So, yeah, I mean, not giving our money to South Africa is just like a quiet, hey, I don't want to be bothered with you guys.
Yeah, I don't want to pay for what you're doing. Right.
Yeah, sanctions, on the other hand, would be, for gross neglect. And you're right. We don't talk enough about China. When I hear Americans talk about racism, I say, you know who the top racist countries are in the world? Japan and China. Both of them. Now, China puts the Uyghurs, not that they're a different race, but they're a religious minority, into the work camps. But still, Chinese are very racist, and so are the Japanese. And you can go down this whole list. You can just Google or Grok it. I say Grok things now because it's a lot easier, I think, and better. Because instead of listing 10 websites on the homepage of a Google search that you have to research, you hit Grok. It investigates 15 pages all at once, consolidates that information, analyzes it, and as well as X posts, and it spits out an answer that would take you hours and hours to research by going down those 15 websites and reading every detailed word. So
the most racist countries in the world are the ones that have seats on the United Nations Human Rights Council. That's who.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sitting here with Grok right now. I have it up on the screen while we're talking. And, I've asked it a few questions along the way. And by the way, the line in the sand is and I thought the reason I researched that, it's from the Alamo. It goes all the way back to 1836. But let's just see, when we ask Grok, what are the most racist countries in the world? Have to type quick. And then I always have to say, keep it brief. because it'll go into 20 paragraphs. All right, let's see. Researching 20 web pages, 2x posts. Oh, now it's saying it's varying in methodologies, blah, blah, blah. But they include, here's other countries besides Japan: India, Lebanon, Bahrain, Libya, Egypt. But that is inconsistent and subjective, so rankings across the board are difficult. So, but yeah, China and Japan are right in there.
Yeah.
So it's like, but yeah, who would have thought India? I guess.
Well, I guess why I asked that question is that obviously whites in South Africa are being discriminated against, and 140 laws theoretically that discriminate against people of a different color of skin. And and nobody in America really knows or cares. And then President Trump says something about whites in South Africa being discriminated against, and it becomes a news story. And people want to turn it into that reverse racism that we all are, because we're accustomed to only whites can be racist. But what about these other nations that nobody says anything about? Slavery is not new. Like, I mean, discrimination against any other group of people, that's been going on since there were humans. I mean, that's not new. Um, but the question I think is fair to ask the American public is, should we, at what point are we deciding to get involved? And like you, I think the answer is that despite what this gentleman says in his interview with Mr. Rubin, the United States of America should not have an official policy about the internal workings of the nation of South Africa. I feel bad for those people. They'll probably never be able to sell their property for their real value because, for a white person to be selling any business in South Africa, people understand you got to get out of Dodge, man. Whoever's going to buy it will want to buy it at a significant discount.
Yeah.
And this guy says he's a fifth generation South African citizen. Should he have to leave that country with 5 generations of history? Does he want to leave the country? I mean, listen, if somebody was going to, have the law on their side that they could take my property and without giving me any compensation for it, I wouldn't like that. I would want to leave that place. And maybe what should happen is all the whites should just leave if they're capable. And as you said, maybe what Donald Trump does is just give additional opportunities for people with white skin who are obviously being discriminated against in the nation of South Africa, an expedited system of immigration to the United States. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know. If we should do anything at all.
Yeah, well, that's what he said he is doing, and I guess that's done now. And we're down to about 2 minutes left, but you're right about the whites wanting to leave is difficult because, as an example, my one guy I know who's a Democrat and a liberal has a Tesla, and he's been wanting to get rid of it, but he went to trade it in, get it in. He was going to buy another vehicle. It's worthless. He can't get rid of it. He's going to take such a beating on it. And he's a faith. There you go. There's that faith for. They eat their own.
Yes.
And I think that's sort of kind of what's happening in South Africa. They're eating their own by making these discriminatory policies. It's going to affect the entire nation, not just white people. I mean, countries stand or fall together.
And by the way, not only South Africa, but neighboring nations are also going to feel the effect of what happens in South Africa. And as you know, the continent of Africa is impoverished to begin with. Can't really afford to lose any other kinds of credible sources of positive economy and positive immigration. So I guess we ought to leave the topic alone, Mike, but I think this is a topic worth mentioning to the American people. I think it's a topic that Americans should think about. Today it's South Africa, tomorrow we don't know where it is or where it might be. There there are European nations, because of the immigration policies of the past several years, that their home population, their traditional population, may not still be a majority. It's crazy, and new alliances will be drawn, and new forms of government will be instituted in these various countries. And I know it means change. And what I know about change is, as much as we hate change, there's also opportunity. And someone will take advantage of that opportunity. Somebody will. But America needs to be vigilant and watch its own backyard. That's my opinion.
All right, Mac and Mike, out.